Let's start with the claim. You've probably seen it online, a viral post, a TikTok thread, maybe a Twitter argument. The idea that Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted the Mona Lisa, was actually black, not inspired by Africa, not influenced by African culture, but literally black himself. At first glance, that sounds completely insane. Leonardo da Vinci is one of the most famous figures in European history, the ultimate Renaissance genius, painter, engineer, inventor, scientist, a man whose notebooks contain designs for helicopters, tanks, parachutes, and flying machines centuries before modern technology. But the internet doesn't let historical figures stay simple, because every few years, the claim resurfaces. Videos appear arguing Leonardo had African ancestry. Articles speculate about his mother's origins, and suddenly, one of the most famous Europeans ever is sitting in the middle of a completely modern debate about race. So let's cut straight to the real question. Where did this idea actually come from? Because the truth is more complicated than either side usually admits, and it starts with something historians still don't fully understand. Leonardo's mother. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 in the small Italian town of Vinci. That much is certain. His father was well documented, Ser Piero da Vinci, a wealthy Florentine notary. But his mother, that's where the mystery begins. For centuries, historians knew almost nothing about her. Her name was Caterina, but records describing who she was, where she came from, or what happened to her after Leonardo's birth were extremely vague, and that gap in the historical record created a perfect opening for speculation. Because if you look at the circumstances of Leonardo's birth, something unusual immediately appears. He was illegitimate. His father was a respected member of Florentine society. His mother was not, which means she was most likely a servant, laborer, or enslaved woman working in the household or nearby. And that detail matters, because 15th century Italy was far more connected to the outside world than most people imagine. Florence wasn't an isolated European city. It was part of a massive Mediterranean trade network. Merchants moved constantly between Italy, North Africa, the Middle East, and the Black Sea. And along those routes, people moved too. Servants, workers, captives taken through Mediterranean slave markets. Women from Circassia, the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East regularly appeared in Italian households. So when historians try to identify Leonardo's mother, they have to consider all of those possibilities, which is where the controversy begins. Because several modern researchers have proposed that Caterina may have been a foreign servant brought to Italy through Mediterranean trade networks. One theory suggests she was Circassian, from the Caucasus region near the Black Sea. Another proposes she may have been North African, and a third suggests she was simply a local Tuscan peasant woman. Right now, historians still debate which explanation is most likely, but here's the key point. None of the surviving evidence confirms she was African, and none of the surviving evidence confirms she wasn't, which means the internet stepped in to fill the gap. Once people realized Leonardo's mother was unknown and possibly foreign, the speculation exploded. Suddenly, people started re-examining Leonardo's appearance, his skin tone in paintings, descriptions written by his contemporaries, even self-portraits that might not actually be self-portraits at all. Some online commentators claim his features look Mediterranean or North African. Others argue that's simply what many Italians looked like in the Renaissance. And when you step back, you realize something important. The debate isn't really about Leonardo. It's about how people today think about identity. Because modern racial categories didn't exist in the 15th century the way they do now. People in Renaissance Italy didn't classify the world using the same definitions of black, white, or European that dominate modern conversations. The Mediterranean was a crossroads. Trade connected Africa, Europe, and the Middle East constantly. Cultural and genetic mixing happened for thousands of years, so trying to force someone like Leonardo into a modern racial box is incredibly difficult, but that hasn't stopped the internet from trying. Because if the claim were true, if the greatest Renaissance genius had African ancestry, it would completely change how people think about one of history's most famous figures. And that possibility alone keeps the debate alive. But before we can answer whether the theory holds any weight at all, we have to look at the actual evidence historians use to reconstruct Leonardo's life. And that evidence leads to a story that's far more interesting than the viral headline. Because the real mystery isn't just who Leonardo's mother was. It's why one of the most famous men in history grew up almost completely outside the social system that produced him. And that strange childhood shaped the mind that would eventually change art, science, and engineering forever. Leonardo's childhood didn't start inside the elite world his father belonged to. And that's the first thing most people misunderstand about him. Yes, his father was wealthy. Yes, his father worked in Florence's powerful legal system. But Leonardo did not grow up as a privileged Renaissance noble. He grew up in a strange middle ground, recognized by his father, but not fully part of his family, because Leonardo was born illegitimate. In 15th century Italy, that mattered enormously. Legitimate sons inherited status, education, and careers. Illegitimate children usually didn't, which meant Leonardo couldn't follow the traditional professional path expected of someone from a powerful Florentine household. He couldn't become a notary like his father. He couldn't easily enter elite university education, and he didn't automatically inherit wealth. Instead, he spent much of his early life in the countryside around Vinci, surrounded by fields, streams, animals, and forests. At first glance, that might sound unimportant, but that rural childhood shaped the way Leonardo's brain worked, because unlike most educated men of his era, Leonardo didn't begin his intellectual life with books. He began it with observation. He watched birds fly. He studied how water moved through streams. He looked at how muscles worked under animal skin. He dissected plants, insects, rocks, clouds. While other boys memorized Latin texts, Leonardo trained his eyes, and that difference would later define everything he created. But before that could happen, another major shift occurred. Around age 14, Leonardo moved to Florence, and Florence in the late 1400s was one of the most explosive intellectual environments in human history. This was the Renaissance at full speed. Art, engineering, architecture, philosophy, science, all exploding at once. We're talking about the same city that produced Michelangelo, Botticelli, Brunelleschi, Machiavelli. Florence wasn't just a city, it was a creativity machine, and Leonardo arrived right in the middle of it. But again, his path into this world was unusual, because he didn't enter it as a scholar, he entered it as an apprentice. His father arranged for him to work in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of Florence's most respected artists. And Renaissance workshops were nothing like modern art studios. They were part laboratory, part factory, part engineering hub. Inside Verrocchio's workshop, artists weren't just painting pictures. They were designing sculptures, building machines, studying anatomy, experimenting with chemistry, mixing pigments, constructing stage props, even designing military equipment. Art and science weren't separate fields. They were the same thing. And for Leonardo, this environment was perfect because his mind didn't operate inside neat categories. He wanted to know how everything worked. Inside that workshop, he learned how to paint, how to sculpt, how to study human anatomy, how to design mechanical systems, how to work with metals, how to understand geometry and perspective. And very quickly, he started outpacing the other apprentices. There's a famous story from this period. Verrocchio was painting a large religious scene called the Baptism of Christ. At some point, he allowed young Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the composition. When the painting was finished, people noticed something strange. Leonardo's angel looked dramatically better than the rest of the painting. The face was softer. The light was more natural. The expression felt alive. According to later accounts, Verrocchio supposedly looked at it and decided he would never paint again. Now historians debate whether that story is completely true, but it illustrates something real. Even early on, Leonardo's talent was obvious. Yet here's the strange part. Despite being surrounded by some of the greatest artists in history, Leonardo never behaved like a typical Renaissance painter. He constantly abandoned projects. He started paintings and never finished them. He accepted commissions and then got distracted by other ideas, because while everyone else focused on art, Leonardo kept drifting into science. He started sketching flying machines, studying bird wings, investigating how water currents moved, drawing complex mechanical gears, taking apart the human body to understand muscles and bones. At night, he filled notebooks with diagrams, inventions, and scientific questions. Over time, those notebooks would grow into thousands of pages, and inside them were ideas centuries ahead of their time. Concepts resembling helicopters, submarines, armored vehicles, gliders, robotic machines. But here's what makes Leonardo fascinating. He wasn't inventing these things because someone asked him to. He was doing it because he couldn't stop asking questions. Why do birds fly? Why does water spiral when it drains? Why do muscles move the way they do? Why does light behave differently on curved surfaces? His brain treated the entire world like one giant puzzle, and that mindset made him completely different from other artists of his era. But it also created a problem, because the Renaissance rewarded people who finished things. Leonardo rarely did. He moved from idea to idea, constantly chasing new questions, which meant that even though he would become the most famous artist in history, during his lifetime he often struggled to maintain stable patronage. Kings hired him, dukes funded him, but they frequently complained about the same thing. Leonardo worked slowly, painfully slowly. Sometimes he would stare at a painting for hours without touching it. Other times he would disappear for weeks chasing scientific experiments. Yet somehow, despite that chaotic approach, he still produced masterpieces that changed art forever, which raises a deeper question. How did someone with such an unconventional upbringing and such an unpredictable mind become the symbol of Renaissance genius? Because the truth is, Leonardo wasn't just an artist. He was something much stranger, a man who treated the entire universe like a system waiting to be decoded. And that obsession would eventually lead him to create the most famous painting on Earth. a painting that people are still arguing about more than 500 years later. Now let's get straight to the controversy. Because the internet didn't start arguing about Leonardo's ancestry for no reason, there are three main pieces of evidence people point to when they claim Leonardo da Vinci might have had African ancestry. And the first one is the simplest. His mother's identity is still unclear. For hundreds of years, historians only had one piece of solid information about her. Her name was Caterina. That's it. No clear birthplace, no detailed description, no confirmed background, which left historians with a mystery. And mysteries attract theories. Modern researchers digging through Florentine tax records and legal documents discovered something interesting. During Leonardo's lifetime, there were multiple women named Caterina living in the region who could potentially match the records. One of them appears to have been a local peasant woman. Another may have been a servant connected to Mediterranean trade networks. And that's where things get interesting, because 15th century Florence was not ethnically isolated. The Mediterranean world was deeply interconnected. Ships moved constantly between Italy, North Africa, the Middle East, and the Black Sea. Along those routes, merchants also transported servants, laborers, and captives who ended up working in European households. Records from the time show women from places like Circassia, the Balkans, the Levant, and North Africa living in Italian cities. Some worked as domestic servants. Others were absorbed into local communities over time. So when historians see that Leonardo's mother might have been a servant connected to trade networks, one possibility is that she came from somewhere outside Italy. But that's still only speculation. There's no document that says exactly where she was born, which leads to the second argument people make, Leonardo's appearance. Some online commentators claim that Leonardo's facial features in paintings and sketches look Mediterranean or North African. They point to the famous red chalk drawing often labeled as his self-portrait, the one showing an older man with long hair and a large beard. But there's a major problem. Historians aren't even certain that drawing is Leonardo. It might be. But it might also be a later artistic study or a portrait of someone else entirely. And even if it is Leonardo, physical appearance alone tells us almost nothing about ancestry. Renaissance. Italians already had huge genetic diversity because the Mediterranean had been a crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years. Romans, Greeks, Arabs, North Africans, Normans all passed through or ruled parts of Italy at different times. So trying to categorize a Renaissance Italian face using modern racial ideas doesn't work very well. Which brings us to the third argument people make. And this one is actually the most interesting. Some historians have suggested Leonardo's mother may have been a foreign servant brought to Italy through Mediterranean commerce. One theory proposes she was Circassian, from the Caucasus region near the Black Sea. Circassian women were frequently brought into European households during that period. Another theory suggests she may have been from the Eastern Mediterranean, and a smaller group of researchers have wondered whether she could have been North African. But again, there's no direct proof. What we really have is a historical puzzle. A powerful Florentine man had a child with a woman who existed outside the social elite. That woman disappears from most records after Leonardo's birth, and centuries later, historians are trying to reconstruct her identity using fragments of documents, which means the truth is probably less dramatic than the internet debates. Leonardo might have had a local Tuscan mother. He might have had a mother from somewhere else in the Mediterranean, but claiming definitively that he was black goes far beyond the available evidence. Yet the theory continues spreading online, and that raises a deeper question. Why are people so fascinated with rewriting the ancestry of historical figures? Part of the answer is representation. Many people today are interested in finding overlooked connections between different cultures in history, and sometimes those discoveries are real. Historians have uncovered African generals in Roman armies, African scholars in medieval Europe, African communities living across the Mediterranean world. History is far more interconnected than older textbooks suggested, but that doesn't mean every famous European figure secretly had African ancestry. Sometimes the historical record simply doesn't support the claim. Still, the debate around Leonardo's origins reveals something important about the Renaissance itself. The Mediterranean world during that time was a cultural crossroads. Ideas, people, and knowledge moved constantly between continents. Artists studied Arabic science. European engineers read translations of Greek texts preserved in the Islamic world. Trade connected Italy to Africa and Asia every day. So while Leonardo himself may or may not have had foreign ancestry, the world he lived in was deeply global, and that global environment shaped the ideas he explored in his notebooks. Which brings us to the real reason Leonardo matters. Because the true story of his genius has nothing to do with viral ancestry debates. It has to do with how he saw the world. Leonardo believed that nature followed hidden mathematical patterns, patterns that connected art, engineering, biology, physics, and architecture. He thought everything in the universe was part of the same system, and once you understand that system, you can create things no one else has imagined yet. That belief is what drove him to design machines centuries ahead of his time. It's what pushed him to dissect human bodies to understand anatomy, and it's what allowed him to paint a portrait that would eventually become the most famous painting on Earth. But to understand how he reached that level of insight, we have to look at the strange way Leonardo approached knowledge itself, because unlike most scholars of his era, Leonardo refused to accept anything just because authority said it was true. He insisted on testing everything with his own eyes, and that habit would eventually turn him into something far beyond a Renaissance artist. Here's the part most people completely miss about Leonardo da Vinci. He wasn't famous in his lifetime for paintings. Not really. Yes, he painted masterpieces like Mona Lisa and The Last Supper. But if you had asked people in Italy during the late 1400s what Leonardo actually did, many of them would have given a very different answer. Engineer, inventor, military designer, architect. Because Leonardo spent far more time designing machines than he did painting. And that mindset tells us something important about how his brain worked. Leonardo didn't see the world the way most artists did. Most painters of the Renaissance focused on beauty. Leonardo focused on systems, how things move, how things break, how things flow, how things connect. He wanted to understand the mechanics behind everything he saw. Take water, for example. Leonardo filled page after page of notebooks studying how water behaved, how rivers curved, how currents spiraled, how turbulence formed. He drew swirling diagrams trying to map the physics of motion centuries before modern fluid dynamics existed. Why? Because Leonardo believed nature followed patterns, and if you could decode those patterns, you could recreate them. That's the same thinking that led him to study birds, not casually, obsessively. Leonardo watched birds in flight for years. He measured their wings. He sketched the way air pushed against feathers. He studied how wings curved during takeoff and landing, all because he believed humans could eventually build flying machines, which sounds ridiculous for the year 1500, except Leonardo actually designed one, a flying device with flapping wings powered by human movement. Today we call it an ornithopter, and while it never successfully flew, the design revealed something astonishing. Leonardo understood the basic mechanics of flight centuries before the technology existed to make it practical, but flight was just the beginning. His notebooks are full of machines that feel almost modern, armored vehicles that look eerily similar to tanks, mechanical gears that resemble early robotics, bridges designed to be assembled quickly during wartime, even early concepts for parachutes. One of his sketches shows a pyramid-shaped parachute structure designed to slow a falling person safely to the ground. In 2000, a skydiver actually tested a parachute built using Leonardo's design, and it worked. That's the level of insight he was operating at. But here's the strange part. Leonardo almost never finished anything. He started projects constantly, paintings, machines, experiments, then abandoned them halfway through, which drove his patrons insane. Imagine hiring someone to paint a masterpiece for your cathedral, and then watching them disappear for months because they're busy dissecting corpses to understand human anatomy. That was Leonardo, because for him, curiosity always came first, money came second, and reputation barely mattered. That attitude is also why he filled thousands of pages with notes no one would read for centuries. Leonardo wrote obsessively, ideas, observations, sketches, questions, but he didn't write them normally. He wrote most of his notes backwards, literally, mirror writing. Text that could only be read properly when reflected in a mirror. Historians still debate why he did this. Some believe it was a way to protect his ideas. Others think it was simply easier for him as a left-handed writer. Whatever the reason, it added another layer of mystery to his work. And those notebooks contained ideas that were hundreds of years ahead of their time. Hydraulic systems, urban planning, human anatomy diagrams more accurate than medical textbooks of the era. Leonardo dissected over 30 human bodies to understand muscles, organs, and bone structure. That kind of work was controversial in his time, but the drawings he produced became some of the most precise anatomical illustrations ever created. Even modern doctors still admire their accuracy. Think about that for a second. An artist working in the late 1400s produced anatomical studies that still impress medical professionals today. That's not normal genius. That's something else entirely. But there's another layer to Leonardo's story that often gets overlooked: his outsider status. Remember, Leonardo was born illegitimate. In Renaissance Italy, that mattered. Illegitimate sons couldn't easily inherit family professions. Leonardo's father was a notary, a prestigious legal position. If Leonardo had been born within marriage, he might have followed the same career path. But because he was illegitimate, that door was closed. So instead, he entered an art workshop, which turned out to be one of the most important accidents in history, because that workshop belonged to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected artists in Florence. Inside Verrocchio's studio, Leonardo didn't just learn painting, he learned metalworking, engineering, sculpture, architecture, chemistry, workshop studios in Renaissance. Florence functioned almost like innovation labs. Artists experimented with materials, mechanics, and design constantly, which meant Leonardo was exposed to multiple disciplines from the beginning. And once his curiosity took over, there was no stopping it. By his 20s, Leonardo was already developing a reputation as a brilliant but unpredictable thinker, someone capable of extraordinary insight but impossible to control. Which brings us to a turning point in his life, because eventually Leonardo left Florence entirely, and when he did, he began working for one of the most dangerous and powerful men in Italy, a man whose ambition would drag Leonardo straight into the brutal politics of Renaissance warfare. Leonardo's next move was ruthless, not artistic, not philosophical, strategic. When Leonardo da Vinci left Florence, he didn't go searching for a painting commission. He went looking for power, and the way he did it reveals a side of Leonardo most people never hear about. He wrote a letter, not to an art patron, not to a noble family asking for creative work. He wrote to Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, and the contents of that letter are shocking, because Leonardo barely mentioned art at all. Instead, he pitched himself as a military engineer. The letter reads like a Renaissance weapons catalog. Leonardo promised he could design portable bridges for armies crossing rivers, defensive fortifications, catapults and siege engines, armored vehicles that could smash enemy lines, cannons designed to fire more efficiently, machines capable of attacking fortified cities. In other words, Leonardo marketed himself as a war technologist. Art was almost an afterthought. Near the end of the letter, he casually added something like, "Oh, and I can also paint if needed." That single letter changed his life, because Sforza hired him, and Milan at the time was one of the most powerful states in Italy, which meant Leonardo suddenly had something he had never had before: resources, workshops, funding, access to engineers and craftsmen. For the next 17 years, Milan became Leonardo's laboratory. This is where he produced some of his most ambitious designs. One of the most famous was an armored war machine, a circular vehicle with slanted metal plates designed to deflect enemy fire. Inside, soldiers would operate cannons positioned around the perimeter. From the outside, the machine looked like a metal turtle. Many historians now refer to it as Leonardo's tank. Was it practical? Probably not. The design had mechanical flaws that would have made it difficult to move, but the concept was extraordinary for the time, because Leonardo was imagining mobile armored warfare 400 years before tanks appeared on battlefields, and he wasn't stopping there. He designed massive crossbows capable of launching enormous projectiles, rotating multi-barrel cannons that could fire repeatedly without long reload times, even early concepts for machine-like artillery systems. Some historians believe Leonardo intentionally added small design errors to certain weapon sketches, possibly to prevent them from being used. Others think he simply hadn't fully solved the engineering problems yet. Either way, his notebooks show a mind constantly experimenting with mechanical power. But Milan wasn't just about weapons. It's also where Leonardo created one of the most famous paintings in human history, The Last Supper. Painted on the wall of a monastery dining hall, the scene captures the moment when Jesus tells his disciples one of them will betray him. But what made Leonardo's version revolutionary wasn't the subject, it was the psychology. Instead of static figures sitting quietly, every person reacts differently. Shock, anger, confusion, suspicion. The entire painting feels like a frozen explosion of human emotion. Leonardo carefully arranged the composition so that every line in the room leads toward the central figure. The perspective draws your eye directly to Christ, and the reactions of the disciples ripple outward like a wave. Today it's considered one of the greatest paintings ever created, but ironically, it started falling apart almost immediately. Leonardo experimented with a new painting technique that didn't bond well with the wall. Within decades, the image began deteriorating, which means the version we see today has been restored and repaired many times over centuries. But even through the damage, the brilliance of the composition remains obvious. Yet despite creating masterpieces like this, Leonardo was still restless. Milan eventually fell into political chaos. Armies invaded, power shifted, and Leonardo once again found himself without a stable patron. So he did what he always did. He moved. Over the next several years, Leonardo traveled between courts and cities across Italy, working for different rulers, designing engineering projects, studying anatomy, experimenting with new ideas, and somewhere during this wandering period, he began working on a painting that would eventually become the most famous portrait in history, Mona Lisa. What makes this painting so fascinating isn't just the subject, it's the mystery, the smile that seems to change depending on how you look at it, the subtle shading technique known as sfumato, where colors blend so smoothly that edges disappear. Leonardo worked on the painting for years, possibly more than a decade, constantly adjusting details, refining layers, perfecting the illusion of life, and unlike many of his other commissions, Leonardo never delivered this painting to a client. He kept it with him, carrying it from city to city for the rest of his life, which suggests something unusual. The Mona Lisa may not have been just another portrait, it might have been Leonardo's personal experiment, a demonstration of everything he had learned about perception, light, anatomy, and emotion. A painting designed not just to show a face, but to capture something deeper, the illusion of a living mind behind the eyes. And that obsession with understanding human perception would eventually lead Leonardo to explore one of the most ambitious questions of his career: how the human brain actually understands the world. Leonardo eventually stopped asking how machines worked and started asking something even bigger. How does the human mind understand reality? That question became an obsession for Leonardo da Vinci, because the more he studied nature, the more he realized something strange. Humans don't see the world directly. The brain interprets it, which meant if Leonardo wanted to become a better artist, engineer, and scientist, he needed to understand how perception actually works. So he began studying the body at a level almost no one in Europe had attempted before. Not just muscles, not just bones, but the entire structure of the human system. And that led him somewhere controversial: human dissection. In Renaissance Europe, dissecting bodies wasn't common practice. Religious beliefs and cultural taboos made many people uncomfortable with the idea. But Leonardo pushed forward anyway. Over the course of his life, he dissected more than 30 human corpses, working late at night in hospitals, carefully examining organs, nerves, muscles, and skeletal structures. What he produced from those dissections shocked modern historians centuries later. His anatomical drawings were unbelievably precise. He mapped the structure of the human spine, detailed the mechanics of the shoulder joint, sketched the heart with accurate chamber structures long before modern cardiology existed. One drawing even shows Leonardo correctly identifying how the aortic valve functions to control blood flow. That level of medical insight wouldn't become standard knowledge until hundreds of years later. But Leonardo didn't stop with anatomy. He also tried to understand the brain. He believed the brain was where perception, memory, and imagination all connected. So he began experimenting with ways to map its structure. One famous experiment involved injecting wax into the brain cavities of an animal skull. Once the wax hardened, he removed the surrounding tissue. This allowed him to study the shape of the internal chambers inside the brain. It was an early attempt to understand neurological structure. Think about that. A Renaissance artist performing experimental brain studies in the early 1500s. But Leonardo wasn't trying to become a doctor. He had a different goal. He wanted to understand how vision works, because painting realistic images required understanding how light interacts with the human eye. Leonardo studied optics intensely, how light travels, how shadows form, how reflections distort images. He realized something artists before him had missed. The human eye doesn't perceive edges clearly. In real life, objects blend softly into their surroundings. That insight led him to develop the technique called sfumato. Instead of sharp outlines, he blended tones gradually so forms appeared to dissolve into light and shadow. This technique is one of the reasons Mona Lisa feels so alive. There are no hard borders around the face. Everything fades subtly into the background, which tricks the brain into interpreting the image as more realistic. Leonardo had essentially discovered how to hack human perception. But what's even more impressive is that he applied this understanding across multiple disciplines: engineering, painting, anatomy, architecture. He treated them all as pieces of the same puzzle. In his notebooks, Leonardo once wrote something remarkable. He said, "Everything connects to everything else." To him, the spiral of a river looked similar to the curl of hair. The branching of tree roots resembled the structure of blood vessels. The patterns of wind turbulence mirrored patterns in flowing water. Leonardo believed the universe ran on repeating mathematical patterns. If you could recognize those patterns, you could predict how systems behaved. Today we call that idea systems thinking. But Leonardo was experimenting with it 5 centuries earlier, and that mindset made him incredibly difficult for people of his own time to understand. Patrons wanted paintings. Leonardo wanted knowledge. They wanted finished projects. He wanted experiments. They wanted reliability. He wanted curiosity. That's why he constantly moved between cities and patrons: Florence, Milan, Rome. Each location gave him new opportunities to explore ideas. But by the time Leonardo reached his later years, Italy had changed dramatically. War was reshaping the region. Foreign armies were invading. Political alliances were collapsing, and a new power was rising north of the Alps: France. Eventually, Leonardo accepted an invitation from the French king himself, a ruler fascinated by the Renaissance genius whose reputation had spread across Europe. That king was Francis I of France, and when Leonardo arrived at the French court, something surprising happened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hired primarily as an artist. He was welcomed as something even greater, a living symbol of human knowledge. The king reportedly called him the greatest philosopher, engineer, and painter of our age. Leonardo spent his final years in France working quietly, surrounded by notebooks filled with ideas most of the world wouldn't fully understand until centuries later. And when he died in 1519, he left behind thousands of pages of sketches, designs, and observations. Pages that would later reveal just how far ahead of his time his thinking truly was, because when historians finally examined those notebooks closely, they realized Leonardo wasn't just a Renaissance artist. He was something far rarer, a mind operating hundreds of years ahead of the world around him. When Leonardo da Vinci died in 1519, something strange happened. Most of his greatest ideas disappeared, not because they were wrong, but because almost no one saw them. Leonardo left behind thousands of pages of notebooks filled with sketches, diagrams, and observations. But those notebooks weren't organized books ready for publication. They were fragments, loose pages, personal notes written in mirror script, half-finished diagrams of machines that didn't exist yet, which meant when Leonardo died, the majority of his work was scattered, stored away, or simply forgotten for centuries. That's one of the most unbelievable parts of this story. The world's most famous genius left behind ideas that wouldn't fully surface until hundreds of years later. Some of those pages describe machines that look eerily modern, helical flying devices that resemble early helicopter concepts, mechanical gears arranged in ways similar to industrial machinery, automated systems using rotating mechanisms and pulleys, even robotic-like designs. One sketch shows a mechanical knight capable of moving its arms, head, and jaw using internal gears and cables. Historians believe this robotic knight may have been designed for court entertainment, but the mechanical principles behind it are surprisingly advanced. Another design shows a vehicle powered by spring-loaded mechanisms, something historians now refer to as a self-propelled cart. In modern terms, it resembles an early concept of a programmable vehicle. It could move automatically along a predetermined path using adjustable gears. That idea sounds very close to early robotics, and yet Leonardo sketched it in the early 1500s. But here's the important thing. Most of these inventions were never actually built, not during Leonardo's lifetime. Technology simply hadn't caught up with his imagination yet. Metalworking tools weren't precise enough. Materials weren't strong enough. Power systems didn't exist to run many of his ideas, so his designs remained on paper, sleeping inside notebooks, waiting for the future. Centuries later, engineers began rediscovering those pages, and the reaction was often disbelief, because the notebooks revealed something historians hadn't fully realized before. Leonardo wasn't just ahead of his time. He was sometimes 3 or 4 centuries ahead. For example, his studies of turbulence in water resemble patterns scientists wouldn't mathematically analyze until the 20th century. His anatomical diagrams of the human heart anticipated discoveries in cardiovascular science that doctors wouldn't formally describe until the 1800s. Even his work on geological layers suggested that Earth had changed over long periods of time, an idea that contradicted common beliefs of the era. Leonardo had quietly arrived at insights that modern science would eventually confirm, without laboratories, without advanced instruments, without the scientific frameworks we use today, just observation, curiosity, and relentless experimentation. But despite all of this brilliance, Leonardo still lived in a world that didn't fully understand what he was doing, which is why his reputation during his lifetime was strangely mixed. Some people saw him as a genius, others saw him as unreliable. A man who started grand projects and rarely finished them, a brilliant mind constantly chasing new ideas instead of completing old ones. And in some ways, they were both right. Leonardo's brain didn't operate like most people's. He wasn't focused on producing a single masterpiece. He was trying to understand how the universe itself worked, which is a much larger problem. But let's go back to the controversial claim that started this entire discussion, the internet theory that Leonardo might have had African ancestry. Whether that claim is accurate or not, it highlights something deeper about his life. Leonardo himself existed between worlds. He wasn't fully accepted by the traditional elite of Renaissance society. Remember, he was born outside of marriage, in a culture where legitimacy determined social status. That meant he never quite fit neatly into the established academic institutions of the time. He wasn't a university-trained scholar. He didn't follow the rigid intellectual traditions dominating medieval Europe. Instead, he built knowledge his own way, through observation, experimentation, cross-disciplinary thinking. And that outsider perspective may actually have been one of his greatest strengths, because Leonardo wasn't limited by the intellectual boundaries other scholars accepted. He questioned everything: how muscles move, how rivers carve landscapes, how birds fly, how machines transfer energy, how the human mind perceives light. Every question led to another, and another, and another, which is exactly why his notebooks became so valuable centuries later. They captured a mind exploring the world without restrictions, a mind connecting art, science, engineering, and philosophy into a single way of thinking. Today we call that kind of thinking interdisciplinary innovation. But Leonardo was practicing it 500 years ago, and the more historians study his work, the clearer something becomes. Leonardo wasn't just a great Renaissance figure. He may have been one of the most intellectually versatile humans who ever lived. But there's still one final question that makes his story even more fascinating. If Leonardo's ideas were so revolutionary, why didn't they transform the world immediately? Why did it take centuries for humanity to catch up with what he was already imagining? Here's the uncomfortable truth about Leonardo da Vinci. Most of his ideas didn't change the world while he was alive. Not because they were wrong, but because the world around him simply wasn't ready yet. Technology moves in layers. One breakthrough usually depends on another, and in Leonardo's time, many of the layers needed to bring his ideas to life simply didn't exist. Take flight, for example. Leonardo studied birds for years. He analyzed wing shapes, air pressure, lift. He designed machines meant to mimic those movements. But there was one problem he couldn't solve: power. Human muscles weren't strong enough to generate sustained lift using his designs. That missing piece, lightweight engines, wouldn't appear for another 400 years. So even though Leonardo understood key principles of aerodynamics, his flying machines remained theoretical. The same thing happened with many of his engineering designs. Leonardo imagined complex gear systems, automated mechanisms, and mobile machines. But Renaissance metalworking lacked the precision necessary to manufacture reliable moving parts at that scale. Even if someone had tried to build certain designs exactly as he drew them, they probably would have broken quickly. It's like designing a modern computer during the Middle Ages. The idea might be brilliant, but without microchips, electricity, and industrial manufacturing, you can't build it. Leonardo was constantly bumping into that limitation. His brain was operating in the future, but his tools were stuck in the past. That's one reason his notebooks became so important later, because once technology caught up, suddenly many of his ideas started making sense. engineers began recognizing principles he had already explored centuries earlier. Historians studying his mechanical sketches noticed patterns similar to later industrial machines. Even scientists analyzing his fluid dynamics drawings realized Leonardo had visually captured turbulence patterns long before modern physics described them mathematically. It was as if a Renaissance mind had quietly mapped pieces of the future, but the world needed time to decode them. And that brings us back to something fascinating about Leonardo's personality. He wasn't trying to rush history. Unlike many inventors who obsess over building working machines immediately, Leonardo seemed more interested in understanding systems. He asked questions that went beyond practical applications. Why do rivers curve the way they do? Why do birds flap instead of glide constantly? Why does light scatter differently across surfaces? Those questions sound abstract, but they're the foundation of modern science. Leonardo believed knowledge itself had value, even if it didn't produce immediate results, which was a radical mindset in the Renaissance. Most patrons wanted tangible outcomes: paintings, buildings, weapons. Leonardo wanted explanations, patterns, connections. That difference is why many of his projects remained unfinished, but it's also why his thinking feels surprisingly modern today. In some ways, Leonardo behaved more like a 21st century researcher than a Renaissance artist. He observed natural phenomena, collected data through sketches, tested ideas through experiments, adjusted his theories as new observations appeared. That approach is very close to what we now call the scientific method, except Leonardo was doing it before the scientific method was formally defined. Centuries before thinkers like Francis Bacon began describing systematic experimentation as a structured process, Leonardo arrived at similar conclusions simply through curiosity. But there's another reason his influence spread slowly: communication. Today, discovery spread instantly. A scientific paper can reach the entire world in minutes. In Leonardo's time, knowledge traveled painfully slowly. Most of his notebooks were never published. They remained private documents, which meant the revolutionary insights inside them stayed hidden for generations. Some notebooks were lost. Others were scattered across Europe. Collectors stored them away. Libraries archived them without fully understanding their significance. It wasn't until centuries later that historians began piecing together the full scope of Leonardo's thinking. And when they did, the reaction was shock, because suddenly the world realized that the famous painter of Mona Lisa had also been quietly exploring engineering, biology, physics, and geology all at once. Leonardo wasn't just an artist. He was a prototype of the modern polymath, a person capable of crossing intellectual boundaries without hesitation. Art, science, engineering, philosophy. Most education systems today separate those disciplines. Leonardo ignored those divisions completely. To him, everything belonged to the same puzzle, and solving that puzzle required looking at the world from every possible angle, which may be the real reason his legacy continues to grow centuries after his death. Because the deeper historians examine his notebooks, the more they realize something remarkable. Leonardo wasn't just thinking differently than the people around him. He was thinking in ways that still feel ahead of us today. And that raises a final question about his life. Not about paintings, not about inventions, but about genius itself. What exactly allowed one person living in the 1400s to think so far beyond the limits of his time? So what actually made Leonardo da Vinci different? not just talented, not just intelligent, but operating at a level that still surprises historians 5 centuries later. The answer isn't one thing, it's a combination of habits that most people never develop, and the first one was simple. Leonardo never stopped asking questions. Not the kind of questions people ask casually, the kind that keep someone awake at night. He wrote thousands of them in his notebooks. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds glide without flapping sometimes? Why do muscles pull instead of push? Why does water spiral when it drains? Why do humans perceive depth with 2 eyes? These weren't random curiosities. Leonardo believed every question pointed to a hidden pattern in nature. If you could uncover that pattern, you could understand the system behind it, which leads to the second habit that made him extraordinary: observation. Leonardo didn't trust assumptions. He trusted what he could see. He spent hours watching water flow over rocks, studying how shadows changed throughout the day, examining how facial expressions shifted when people felt different emotions. He even watched how people walked in public spaces to understand human movement. Then he drew everything, relentlessly, sketch after sketch after sketch, because drawing forced him to analyze details most people ignore: where muscles connect, how joints rotate, how light changes across curved surfaces. Leonardo once wrote something revealing in his notebooks. He said, "Learning never exhausts the mind." For him, knowledge wasn't a task, it was a way of living, which leads to the third habit that set him apart. Leonardo refused to stay inside one discipline. Most scholars during the Renaissance specialized in a single field. Theologians studied religion. Engineers studied mechanics. Artists studied painting. Leonardo studied all of them. Art informed his anatomy studies. Anatomy improved his painting. Engineering inspired his architecture designs. Architecture influenced his understanding of geometry. Every subject reinforced the others. That kind of cross-disciplinary thinking is extremely powerful, because breakthroughs often happen when ideas from one field collide with another. Leonardo was constantly creating those collisions, which may explain why his notebooks contain ideas that seem disconnected at first glance. A drawing of a human heart next to a design for a hydraulic pump, a sketch of bird wings beside calculations about mechanical gears. But inside Leonardo's mind, these ideas were linked. They were all examples of systems in motion. Living systems, mechanical systems, natural systems. Understanding one helped explain the others, and that mindset produced a fourth habit that made Leonardo unusual. He embraced experimentation. If he didn't understand something, he tested it. If he couldn't test it directly, he modeled it with sketches and mechanical concepts. Sometimes he was wrong, very wrong. But Leonardo didn't treat mistakes as failures. He treated them as information. Every failed idea revealed something new about the system he was studying. That willingness to experiment is the foundation of modern science. But Leonardo practiced it instinctively, long before formal research institutions existed. And finally, there was one more trait that defined him: patience. Leonardo wasn't rushing to publish discoveries or win academic debates. He spent years refining ideas, returning to the same problems again and again. The famous portrait known as Mona Lisa may have taken more than a decade of adjustments, layer after layer of subtle changes, minute refinements in shading and expression. Because Leonardo wasn't chasing speed, he was chasing understanding. And that pursuit of understanding is why his work still feels modern today, Because the world eventually caught up with the way he thought. Scientists now study turbulence in fluid dynamics. Engineers design flying machines. Doctors analyze the human body with precision imaging. Architects use structural mathematics to build massive structures. All fields Leonardo explored in early forms centuries ago. Which brings us back to the original claim that started this conversation, the debate over Leonardo's ancestry. Was he entirely Italian? Did his mother come from somewhere else in the Mediterranean world? Could she have had foreign roots? Historians may never know the full answer. Records from the 15th century simply aren't detailed enough to settle the question completely. But focusing only on that debate misses something much bigger. Leonardo's real significance isn't where his ancestry came from. It's what his mind was capable of doing. He showed that curiosity, observation, and interdisciplinary thinking could unlock insights far ahead of their time. And that may be the most powerful lesson his life leaves behind. Because Leonardo didn't wait for permission to explore ideas. He simply followed his questions wherever they led, even if the world around him wasn't ready to understand the answers yet. And that brings us to the final piece of this story. Why Leonardo's legacy continues to grow stronger 500 years after his death. 500 years after Leonardo da Vinci died, something remarkable is still happening. His reputation keeps getting bigger, not smaller. Usually history does the opposite. Over time, myths fade, exaggerations get corrected, and famous figures become a little less impressive once historians look closely at the evidence. But Leonardo's story has gone the other direction. The deeper researchers dig into his notebooks, the more extraordinary he appears, because new generations keep discovering ideas he explored long before they became common knowledge. His anatomical drawings continue to impress medical historians. His mechanical sketches still fascinate engineers. His paintings are still analyzed by art historians trying to decode the techniques he used. And the portrait that refuses to lose its grip on the world's imagination is still hanging in a museum in Paris, Mona Lisa. Millions of people travel every year just to stand in front of it for a few seconds. Not because it's the largest painting, not because it's the most colorful, but because it contains something difficult to explain, a subtle illusion of life. The smile seems to shift depending on how you look at it. The eyes appear to follow you across the room. The expression feels almost human in a way that many portraits do not. Leonardo spent years perfecting the techniques that created that effect, layering extremely thin glazes of paint, softening shadows so they gradually fade into surrounding light, carefully controlling how the viewer's eye moves across the image. What he created wasn't just a portrait, it was a psychological experiment in perception. But even that painting represents only a tiny fraction of what Leonardo explored, because his notebooks reveal a mind that refused to stay inside one category. He wasn't just an artist, not just an engineer, not just a scientist. He moved constantly between fields, drawing inspiration from wherever his curiosity led. And that curiosity is the real reason Leonardo still matters today, because the modern world is increasingly realizing something Leonardo instinctively understood centuries ago. The biggest breakthroughs often happen between disciplines, when biology meets engineering, when mathematics meets art, when physics meets design. Leonardo lived in that intersection permanently, which is why modern innovators often look back at his work for inspiration. Tech founders quote his ideas about curiosity. Engineers admire his ability to visualize mechanical systems. Designers study how he combined aesthetics with function. He has become a symbol of something rare, the polymath, a person capable of mastering multiple domains instead of specializing in only one. And in a world that increasingly values narrow expertise, Leonardo represents a different path, one driven by endless learning, endless questioning, endless exploration. Now let's return one last time to the controversy that sparked this entire discussion. The internet claimed that Leonardo might have been black, or that he had African ancestry. As we've seen, historians simply don't have evidence strong enough to confirm that claim. The truth is more uncertain. Leonardo's mother, Caterina, remains a partially mysterious figure in the historical record. Some theories suggest she may have come from somewhere outside Italy. Others argue she was most likely a local Tuscan woman. Without definitive documents, the debate will probably continue. But the real point is this: Leonardo's importance doesn't come from fitting neatly into any modern identity category. It comes from the way he thought. He approached the world with relentless curiosity. He challenged accepted ideas. He tested observations with experiments. He refused to limit himself to a single discipline. That mindset produced insights far beyond what people expected from someone living in the late 1400s. And that's why his legacy has survived half a millennium, because the qualities that defined Leonardo's mind are still the qualities that drive discovery today: curiosity, observation, experimentation, creativity. If Leonardo were alive in the modern world, he probably wouldn't stay inside a single profession. He might be designing spacecraft, studying artificial intelligence, exploring medical imaging, or building entirely new technologies we haven't imagined yet. Because the same question that drove him 500 years ago still drives innovators today. How does the world actually work? And once you understand that, what can you create next? That's the real story of Leonardo da Vinci. Not a myth, not a viral internet theory, but a human mind so relentlessly curious that centuries later, we're still trying to catch up.